Welcome to Collegium Booster Shots, an occasional podcast in which we hear from Collegium alums about the creative and school-specific ways they took what they learned during their colloquy and applied it to their teaching and scholarly and creative work. I'm your host, Karen Eifler, Executive Director of Collegium, and today I'm delighted to sit down for a conversation with Kara Cunningham Warren and Courtney Griffin, who are colleagues at University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. Kara is an alum of the 2025 Collegium cohort at St. John's University, and while she was there, she found lots of convergences with innovative strategies she was already working on with Courtney to help their students learn to converse thoughtfully and constructively, even when their positions on crucial matters are wildly disparate. They recently took their workshop on the road to Washington, D.C., where they were warmly received. In these fractured times, I think it's safe to say we can't have enough arrows in our quiver to foster civil and productive discourse, so I'm really grateful for this chance to unpack some portable strategies for doing so. Kara and Courtney, welcome.
Thank you so much, Karen. We're delighted to be here with you today.
Great. Let's dive right in. But before we dive into that innovative dialogue formation program that you've devised for your students and colleagues at University of Detroit Mercy School of Law, would you each take a moment to sketch the highlights of the roles that you serve there?
I can begin. Courtney Griffin. I am the Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Detroit Mercy Law. And I am responsible for ensuring that faculty, students, and staff all have a sense of belonging here at the law school and being sure that the law school is an inclusive, welcoming, and just a great learning environment for students.
And I'm just wrapping up my 26th year of teaching at Detroit Mercy Law. And I really started to work with Courtney on this topic in my role as the chair of our Law School Professional Development Committee, and then also as a member of the university's faculty development team.
Famously known for herding cats or dealing with a bucket of eels, right? So
Yes.
kudos to you for taking that on. Well, let's get going on the dialogue project that you've created for faculty and students. It's impossible to read any editorial or hear any pundit and not hear how we've all apparently lost our ability to converse civilly with one another, let alone have serious debates on policies that matter without devolving into attacks and retreating to our echo chambers. Would you talk a little bit about what inspired your efforts on this project and describe some of the broad strokes of how it's unfolded at Detroit Mercy School of Law? And Kara, how about if we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I think Courtney and I both have taken different paths, but we've come together and have really grown and have loved that endeavor. For me, it started back even with undergrad. I'm a political scientist and social scientist by nature, and my scholarship has focused on why do legal questions become culture wars? And my scholarship has focused on the balance between state and federal government power. So I looked at Flint water crisis or the sanctuary city debate, and I said, why are the legal issues being masked by this vitriol and by this identity politics that each of these then legal issues are becoming culture wars? So that was where my scholarship was. But then after I became a full professor and tenured, I started to do the Ignatian spiritual exercises with Father Cy Hendry, and it's a year-long exercise an academic year-long exercise at Detroit Mercy. And I was saying, I'm a full professor, I'm tenured, like what's next? And what one word that really started to percolate upward, I discerned this word dialogue. And I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know how I was supposed to use it, but I had this sense of dialogue being an important next step for me. And then I started to work with Courtney.
Courtney, how
Detroit
about you?
Mercy Law is a Mercy Jesuit institution. And so the beauty of that is we have strong social justice values. And I heard from students that they came to Detroit Mercy for our strong social justice values. However, when we got into the classroom, the students weren't seeing those social justice issues played out in their classes, and they were slightly disappointed. And so as the chair of the Professional Development Committee, I was part of the Professional Development Committee. I went to Kara and we said, okay, what can we do? How can we make this work? And so our job was really to ensure that our Mercy and Jesuit values were interwoven throughout all of our curriculum and that our faculty felt comfortable and confident leading those social justice and what could be difficult conversations in the classroom.
And so I don't think either one of us knew what we were in for. That was literally like a hallway conversation. But what it's turned into is that we now have a 20-hour training session for faculty. And this summer we'll do our third cohort. So the faculty go through a 20-hour training session on how to use dialogue techniques in their classrooms.
And it's voluntary. Do I understand that? So faculty opt into this formation program that you've devised?
Yes, we ask for volunteers, and the faculty members receive a stipend for their participation. And again, it's 20 hours of them doing either prep work or working directly with us. And then they agree in exchange for receiving the stipend to integrate at least 3 hours of dialogue into at least one of their courses for that academic year.
Okay. Well, let's get really practical because our listeners love practical, stealable ideas to take into their own context. Would you describe some of the strategies you found to be most successful in forming dialogue coaches and dialogue participants? Courtney, how about we start with you?
Absolutely. So I am your participants, your viewers. I love practicality. I love stealable ideas. However, I'm going to give you some background history before I give you the stealable ideas. So I apologize in advance because I realize at this point we have not given you the 4 stages of dialogue. And so we're just talking a dialogue at a really high level. So there are 4 stages of dialogue in which we, again, spend the 20 hours with our faculty members or with our participants. And so the first stage is really setting the stage and getting our participants to understand the difference between dialogue and debate and really setting the tone and making sure that there's a brave space and that everyone feels comfortable before we dive into the material. And then stage 2 really focuses on those social identities and truly understanding yourself and how and why this is important and what your biases are. And then stage 3 is the dialogue and the facilitation. And so that's when we practice different dialogues and work together to actually facilitate and get comfortable being uncomfortable. And then stage 4 for me is the practicality piece. So that is when we're working on allyship and talking about what exactly we can do with this information going forward. And that's my favorite portion of the dialogue. So I'm thinking back to when we were at President Lincoln's cottage. We went through the 4 stages of dialogue and we asked them like, okay, what pieces would you like to incorporate? And so they had a range of ideas of different ways to include it. And for our faculty, we actually workshop together and say, okay, what pieces would you include? Why would this work? Why wouldn't this work? And so we work through that practicality piece together, but I'll give it over to Kara so she can give you some stealable ideas.
Well, those are quite stealable. Thanks for setting the stage so nicely, Courtney.
Yeah, Courtney loves stage 4. She's all about the allyship and what do we take from what we're learning. I agree that that's a really important next step. And people want to get to allyship much sooner than they're really ready. Like we still need to have the conversation and they're already thinking about solutions. But the other stage that I think is so critical to focus on is stage 2. And that is, as Courtney mentioned, this internal conversation that we're having about who are we? How have we been socialized? How is it that we respond to information? And the more that people can recognize their own blind spots or recognize their own triggers, that's preparing them to engage in this world. So I see a lot of benefit to doing that internal reflection. And then as Catholic institutions, right, we have so many tools at our disposal, whether it's, the Examine, or if it's the different Benedictine traditions of reflection, reading slowly, looking in nature for things that help you better understand and unearth your thoughts. So for me, stage 2, that internal reflection does a lot of heavy lifting.
And I love how you didn't say use in the classroom or use in their work. You said use in the world. It seems really portable to a well-lived life, as well as any benefits that we see in a classroom or a faculty room. I think it'd also be great to hear some of the specific dialogue techniques that you use in your classrooms and your formation sessions with faculty, maybe along with some of the hot topics that you've been able to teach using these techniques. And Kara, how about if you start that one?
Sure. As I mentioned, each dialogue fellow at Detroit Mercy then takes their dialogue techniques into a course. For me, I developed a semester-long class on dialogue focused on Israel and Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the techniques that I found, a lot of this comes, there's an article, I'll be happy to share it with the listeners, written by Professor Zeniga. But one technique that she gave us was to define keywords. And when I first read that, I sort of landed like a lead balloon. I was like, okay, I'm not really sure what that's going to do. But in the class, I asked students to define the word peace. And that seems to have a very universal definition. But when you ask people of different backgrounds to define that, especially in the context of Israel and Palestine, you realize that a lot of people's subconscious thoughts, their experience inform that definition. And it's very different. So for people focused on an Israeli perspective, they're looking at self-defense or security. That's what brings peace. People who are focused on a Palestinian perspective would say self-determination, the inherent right and recognition of the dignity of a human person. So very different definitions of the same word. So that's a great technique to use to just unearth people's underlying assumptions.
And is that as straightforward as when you hear the word peace, what does that bring to mind? I mean, just kind of a conversation there, or is it more technical than that?
No, it definitely is a question right along those lines. What I did find, and this would be another practical tip, is that previous reflection. So the students would have a week to go through and work through a series of reflections and then come to class ready to give that definition.
Mm-hmm.
And Courtney, we've got a couple techniques we'd love to share with you.
Oh,
And so
yeah, can't wait to hear them.
another technique we often use is called a fishbowl. And so the fishbowl works best when there are opposing views. And what's really great about this example is we were having a faculty meeting where we could say everyone had a strong opinion. And so after the faculty meeting, we said we should have a dialogue. One of our dialogue fellows came and said, you know what, this seems like a great opportunity for a dialogue. And so we were trying to debate if we should make a change to our curriculum. And how the fishbowl activity works is you kind of envision there's a smaller group inside that are having a conversation, and they have their conversation as if no one was around the outside. Everyone listens, and then the teams switch. And so at this point, everyone is able to feel heard. And so what we found from that fishbowl activity when we were debating if we should make changes to the curriculum, people usually had the same idea of why or why not we should make the change, but different reasons why. And so leaving that fishbowl activity was probably one of the first times where everyone had felt heard. Because you weren't listening to respond, you were actually just listening. And so we were able to have good responses from that conversation.
Yeah.
Do people who are observing in a fishbowl activity, is someone keeping track of what they're hearing, or how does the follow-up dialogue unpack from something like fishbowl?
It depends. In our instance, we voted on it as a faculty committee at the next faculty meeting. So that was simply an opportunity to have your voice heard and to be sure everyone understood what the changes could or would include.
Okay.
What I would add is we'd had not been able to move the needle on that question for over a year. And what we found after that dialogue is people were saying yes if we have the resources, and people were saying no because we don't have the resources. So our yes and no's were essentially the same. Like if we have the resources, we want to do it. But it wasn't until we could just sit down and listen completely to one side and listen to the other side that then we realized we're really saying the same thing.
It's really more than a classroom practice. It's a professional practice in faculty meetings and committee meetings and so on. Are there other techniques that you'd like to unfold for us?
Yeah, there are a few that I think are really important. One, and this is a shout out to the colloquy, is Diane Millis's generous listening. That has so much value. Just the idea of putting the speaker at the center, and it's not your job to then offer your own thoughts, but really to be a mirror for the person who's speaking and to keep the speaker at the center. Two other related exercises or techniques. One is the idea of identifying false narratives or false binaries. And I do this in the my international law class as well as the Palestine-Israel conflict or dialogue course. And I show a short video where it shows women in Israel giving birth under bombardment, and the nurses describing how it's really difficult to move women under anesthesia safely. And then you shift to then women giving birth in Gaza, C-sections with no anesthesia. And so if your false narrative is like you're either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, then you start to make these choices about, well, are the Israeli women really in danger, or is it really as bad in the Palestinian hospitals as the photos suggest? And I'd say that's a false choice. The question could be reframed to say, women and children, and how do we protect them against the people who would harm them? So one technique is just to recognize and be practiced at recognizing when you're being forced to make a choice in, a false binary. But related to that is an exercise that I use with students to try and help them identify nuanced positions. So for example, with respect to SNAP benefits, I take half of the class and I say, identify every single argument in favor of reducing SNAP benefits. You don't have to agree with them, but just think of every potential argument. And then the other group, think of every potential argument against expanding SNAP benefits, even if you agree or disagree with them, but just come up with a laundry list. Then each side represents or presents their arguments, and you realize that there's a nuanced position. So people who are against SNAP benefits are worried about fraud and waste. People who are for SNAP benefits are interested in feeding hungry kids. So you say, all right, if the nuanced position then would be, let's get rid of fraud and waste, and let's make sure we're feeding the hungry kids. So that's an example of just a very practical exercise that helps you realize we're looking at this in terms of black and white. We need to look for the nuance. So to recap the different techniques, defining key terms, the fishbowl, generous listening, looking and being trained to identify these false choices, and then the specific exercises that get you to the nuanced positions. And that's where you can get to Courtney's favorite stage of allyship, is to say, then what do we do about feeding kids and getting rid of fraud and waste?
Courtney, do you want to follow up on that? How do you cultivate the sense of allyship and empowering people to have the tools to become articulate and effective allies?
As Kira mentioned, throughout our 20-hour dialogue, our faculty are usually anxious and ready to get to stage 4, because it's usually how you have a discussion. You identify a problem, and then especially as lawyers, you fix the problem. And so kind of forcing our faculty to sit back and go through all of the stages before they can identify allyship really allows us to, one, create that brave space and get comfortable being uncomfortable and thinking outside of the box of, okay, who else does this impact? What voices are not included at the table? And so by the time we get to the allyship, we're having a holistic discussion of, again, who does this impact? How will this impact us? How will this impact others? To be sure that we're not just making a blanket decision of canceling the SNAP benefits when it's, wait a second, let's take a pause. Who will be affected? How can we do this effectively?
Wonderful. Well, you've been at this for a while now, and you're about to welcome your third cohort of faculty colleagues to enter the formation program. What do you wish you'd known or thought about before you started this Constructive Dialogues formation program?
I wish I would have known how much this would require me to be uncomfortable. I am not a huge feelings, touchy-feely kind of person. And so to really dive deep into dialogue and truly understand, how what my biases are, and how I navigate through the world, I really had to dig deep down into, my childhood and my identities and how I was socialized. And I was not prepared to that. And I also wasn't prepared to share it with the masses.
And you're in a position of leadership, so you've got to kind of walk the talk. That would be really uncomfortable if you hadn't been anticipating those feels coming up. Kara, how about you?
I look at the world, I think, through the eyes of a child, and I'm overly optimistic. And
Mm,
once I had this tool, I was like, okay, like here we go. And I realized now that I needed to be more realistic about what actually could be accomplished. And I thought I had a whole semester to work with these students on Israel and Palestine. And I envisioned this wonderful moment where the people on opposite ends of the spectrum came together and really saw each other. And it happened, but not in the fullest way that I thought. And I realized, to go to Courtney's point, there is so much to unpack about who we are and how we got here that one semester even is
mm,
really not enough. And that's why I'm leaning heavily into that stage 2 self-reflection. It's a lifelong practice. The other thing I think that I wish I would have known is that Courtney's mentioned the word brave space, and that's something that we're really setting the environment. We can't guarantee that somebody is going to feel safe or they're not going to
mm,
be hurt or offended, but the most we can do is we're going to create a space where you can hopefully feel authentic and share your
mm,
authentic self. But what I realize now is not every classroom can be a brave space, or not every interaction with someone can be a brave space, and that you actually do have to protect yourself, knowing that I'm not sure what the other person thinks or what their motivations are or whether they've been trained.
mhm,
So, big picture for me is to realize that as wonderful as dialogue is, there are limitations to what it can do in a given moment. And so to really be realistic about what you might achieve in a given session or even in a full semester, and not to lose heart, but just
mm.
to say, wow, there was more work here than I realized, and let's keep working at it.
Have either of you ever had someone just opt out in the middle of the formation, in the middle of the
Yes.
program, in the middle of a class? What does that look like? What does it feel like?
So one rule, it's really important to set community norms. And one rule that we say is what happens in the session stays in the
Mm,
session, but the
mhm.
lessons learned can travel.
Okay.
So without revealing anything in particular, I noticed that I did feel defensive. Like, is it something that I wasn't being a good teacher? It also, I think, made me feel sad when I see somebody who has a blind spot.
Mm,
I could see it come out in their reflections or the way that they were talking. But blind spot is a really apt description. I mean, it's a blind spot, and you don't know that you have it. And so, in some ways, that can feel. I feel sad that I. What could I do to help that person realize that they have a blind spot?
mhm. Courtney, anything occur to you or when you've had to confront that?
I would echo Kara. It's just really an opportunity of self-reflection. And so
Mhm,
if you were not ready to dig that deep or to be that vulnerable, then you won't be able to fully partake in the dialogue. And that was a learned lesson for all parties of
mhm.
is you have to be ready.
What one
Yes.
thing that we did is we realized the first time we caught that we taught this, we had a lot of time for people to share about their identities and their thoughts. And now we're like, we're going to give you time to think about it, and then to the extent you want to share, but less putting people on the spot, and they can share when they're comfortable or
Mhm,
when they're ready. And
mhm,
we even have added, like, if you dislike this reflection, then reflect on why you think you
mm,
dislike it
mhm,
rather than
mhm.
just not completing it.
Yeah, wonderful. Good. Have you seen any impact on faculty who've gone through the formation program that extends beyond their classrooms?
Yes, Courtney and I, we see it everywhere. And maybe, I don't know if it's because, what's the phrase, like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I don't know if everything looks like a dialogue opportunity. But for me, I've seen it come up in a range of courses.
Mm,
So in a large first year property class, we have a colleague who, before they start landlord tenant law, that unit, she asks them with a simple statement, the tenant did not pay rent. And then the students fill in the gaps. Well, who was the tenant? Was the rent late? And so that's just one way in a really large class that you can use some dialogue techniques. As we've mentioned, we use them in faculty meetings now. We also have a colleague who has twin boys, and she's used dialogue to
yeah.
decide whether the teenage boys can get cell phones. So many ways.
I just have to think that having, at this point, a critical mass of your faculty engaged with these and having been through your workshops would change the nature of contentious faculty meetings and policy groups and so on. Has that been the case?
And honestly, that's the piece that brings me the most joy is we can have a contentious faculty meeting, and then one of our dialogue fellows will come and say, I think we should have a dialogue. And
Mm-hmm.
so that really makes the work the most meaningful to me and truly shows that that our participants, one, understood and they see value in the work, but then two, that it actually works. And so that's the practicality in me. That's the piece I enjoy most is when others come and say, we should have a dialogue about that.
You have succeeded. I mean, that has to feel so gratifying. Well, I'm going to give each of you the chance for the final word. What's one practical piece of advice you want to offer someone who has been inspired by what they've heard from you today?
I'll start and I'll be brief. I'll just simply say to be open to dialogue is truly being open and willing to go beyond like water cooler talk. You're really having to truly understand yourself and be willing to be uncomfortable with the masses. And so just understanding that it is a journey, it's absolutely worth it. Just really start by identifying what makes you you, what your biases are, and then truly be open to listening to other people's biases and those lived experiences.
For me, going back to your earlier point about how dialogue could get you through a contentious faculty meeting, I want to circle back to the point about blind spots. And there was a curriculum proposal last fall, and it hurt me, it troubled me, it really triggered me. And I felt so certain that I was right. And I felt so certain that if I could just tell people and help them understand my position, then of course they couldn't help but agree. But 4 meetings in a row, the vote was the same, 14-10. And I just kept losing. And I kept saying, well, they just must not hear what I'm saying. And I can't understand why they can't hear me, but they can't hear me. And my takeaway from that is the more certain that I felt, because I was triggered, I was in fight mode. So I was in a faculty meeting filing motions and asking for certain relief. But then also because I was hurt, I withdrew and I stopped talking to the people that I really needed to talk to. And so my big takeaway was that I had a huge blind spot. I was operating from a blind spot. And the way moving forward that I can recognize when I'm in that blind spot is if I feel super certain, but I'm not able to bring anybody with me, that's a sign that I'm missing perspectives. And as soon as I started to talk to the people on the other side, then we moved past it. But it wasn't until I realized that I needed to really be in conversation with other people, not of the people who agreed with me, but the people that disagreed with me and better understand where they were coming from. And it was so ironic. Like I have like a dialogue t-shirt, dialogue printed on my head, but I did not see it myself. And so that's the work about these blind spots.
Well, all of that is so portable and so stealable. I'm excited to try some of them myself. And what a gift it's been to talk with you, Courtney and Kara. Thank you, and continued blessings and gratitude to you for all you've done and will continue to do to help your students and colleagues develop their intellectual, spiritual, and ethical development to foster leadership, service, and justice, which are all part of your school's mission statement. And thank you to you, our listeners, for all the ways you work to help your students and colleagues pay attention to what matters and to develop tools to use their educations to scrape some crud off our bruised, blessed world. We'll be back soon with more inspiration from Collegium alums. In the meantime, to invoke Mary Oliver's instructions for living a life, pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. Peace be with you.